Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Flan Talk. This week we have Ekdeep Singh Lubana. He's a research fellow at the Harvard program in Physics and Intelligence, and today he's going to tell us a little bit about in-context learning. So, Ekdeep, thank you, and take it off.
Um, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to talk about today is this high-level title of rationales of in-context learning. It's a loss complexity trade-off. Just to motivate what we're going to talk about here. In-context learning, at this point, it's like a well-known phenomenon capability of language models, where like I can just offer in context a model several exemplars of a task, and then you'll find that lo and behold, if you offer it a novel query, it is able to basically inductively learn over the in-context exemplars and perform output the right label for a novel target or for a novel query. And in some sense, like this is a fascinating thing that the only other species we're aware of who can do this in sufficiently general manner is humans. Like this is essentially meta learning at its best. And then like there's substantially more general variants that you can think about here. Like on the left-hand side, what I'm showing is a few short variant of in-context learning, where you provide independent exemplars of the task. But you can also have a more general form notion of in-context learning as belief update, that I may have like certain beliefs over, let's say, tokens, concepts, and then when offered said tokens or concepts with novel attributions or novel meanings, novel semantics associated with them, I can learn these novel semantics and start to productively use them. So here in this case, this was a kind of fascinating result from the Gemini team where they showed a language which has about an order of 100 speakers and offered the dictionary and the grammar book for that in context to Gemini, and it was able to actually make linguistically, like actually semantically and syntactically correct sentences for this language. And as has been the case for the last, basically at this point, 6, 7 years, anytime we see an axis working well with our models, we're like, can we scale it up? And scale we did. So in-context learning got scaled. So what that means is you just offer more exemplars, more context to the model, and see whether its performance starts to improve. And it does. You can see on the left-hand side in this really cool paper by Agarwal et al., you provide exemplars for translation, and the model's ability to perform translations keeps on steadily improving. The same thing holds for summarization on the right-hand side. Eventually, it starts to degrade, unclear why, but like we get U-shaped slash inverse scaling curves in other domains as well, or for other axes as well. So something similar might be around. Now, this is cool that we can get this phenomenology to show up. But then there was this paper that really started this whole series of papers that I'm going to talk about from our lab, which is many-shot jailbreaking. In this paper, what the authors found was that as you're increasing the amount in context, you're providing exemplars corresponding to behaviors that we have actively tried to remove from a model. Like we want the model to not engage in these behaviors, like violent or hateful speech. You'll find that once you provide a critical number of exemplars, the model actually starts to engage in these behaviors. So like just if I zero shot ask the model to engage in the behavior, it does not. But if I keep on providing exemplars, there's a critical point after which it genuinely just straight away starts to engage in the behavior fairly frequently. So on the left-hand side, it's this percentage of harmful responses metric, which is a very discrete metric. So I don't really like to look at that. Like what I really find fascinating is the middle part, the negative log likelihood of harmful responses. You can see these kind of like wedges slash transitions occurring in the loss itself, where the model first does not deem these generations, which are, let's say, what we would call psychopathic in nature, to be likely. But then, like, there's this certain sudden change in the loss, and the model suddenly starts to find these generations to be very likely. So what this does is it brings us to this kind of like motivating argument for a bulk of the work that in-context learning was often used for eliciting capabilities out of a model. But if the capability elicitation is unreliable, because if I just add one more exemplar, the model might start to show the ability, then like I can't quite trust this as an elicitation tool. So the obvious question to ask then is like, what drives this? When can we trust in-context learning as a reliable tool versus not? Now, I'm not going to answer the entire like the question itself, but I'm going to start making some progress towards that by offering like a few series of results and experiments we've done in the past year at this point. Okay, so these are the main three papers. The first paper is supposed to kind of show, kind of help us create like this toy task, which captures the spirit of the many-shard jailbreaking phenomenon, where we will show that model representations actually completely change in context. Second paper then like takes this toy abstraction from a real model and then creates a toy model of said abstraction. This is now a setting where we can actually create, where we can like perfectly analyze, because we have control over the data as well as the model, exactly what drives the phenomenology we were observing. And then in the third paper, we start to offer an explanation at a behavioral level. None of this will be mechanistic in account, but you'll see, hopefully, the relation with respect to a lot of the theme of this talk series, formal languages that drove a lot of the inspiration for the task design. Okay, so first paper in context learning of representations. These are my great collaborators. Okay, so the task here is very simple. What we're going to do is I have a state space defined by concepts I am fairly confident my model has seen before. So this will be all the experiments I'm going to talk about right now are a Llama 8B model. So I'm taking an off-the-shelf pre-trained model. I'm not going to do any training at all. I'm going to offer to the model in context a random walk on a graph, a structured graph, where the nodes of the graph correspond to these concepts I'm fairly confident the model has seen before during its pre-training. Now, what do you do what do you get when you do a random walk like this, as shown in panel B, is a string, which is basically the random walk itself: apple, bird, milk, sun, and so on. We're going to offer this string to the model in context. We're not going to say a random walk on a grid or anything. We're literally just going to say apple, bird, milk, sand, and so on. Nothing else is told to the model. So model is free to do whatever it wants. It can just start saying like, why are you talking gibberish? But as it so happens, if you keep offering enough context to the model actually starts to make next token predictions, which are in line with the graph structure. So what you see is that, let's say in this walk, if the walk ends at opera on panel A, in panel A, then you'll see that the next valid tokens, egg, plain, and mango, which are the neighbors of opera, the probability associated with the neighborhood of the last token, we sum that probability, and that's what we report as an accuracy on the y-axis. So it's a fairly continuous metric, which is suggestive of, is the model following the graph structure in its next token predictions or not? And like, just at a high level, this already captures the many-shard jailbreaking result. Like, this is already able to produce as a function of context. These are individual rollouts per plot, where we're just increasing the graph size, but like a single rollout is being plotted. So there's no averaging going on, nothing. If within a single rollout, you can get this phenomenon to emerge. So then the question becomes, what is happening under the hood? So to that end, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at the representations of the model. I'm going to plot two metrics similar to what we were doing before, accuracy, but this other metric called Dirichlet energy. I'll explain in a second. Specifically, what's going to happen is I'm going to do my random walk. Let's say the walk ends at opera. I'm going to take the representation of opera from layer 26 of the model. So this is a Llama model. Layer 26 is somewhere but like 60, 70% into the model. And I have results for other layers as well. Layer 26 was the first layer where we saw this, so that's where this plot is from there. But pretty much all layers will eventually show this phenomenon. The idea is you take the representation of, let's say, the walk ends at opera, the representation of opera, but then you take a window before that. So let's say you take a window of 30 tokens before that. So if the walk was length 100, you take token 70 to 100, and you pull out the representations for all the tokens that you saw in that window. So ideally, all the tokens in your state space have been observed at least once in that window. And if they have been, then you get a representation for each of those tokens. And you can simply do a PC of that. So we're going to do a 2D PC of that and plot that on the right-hand side as a function of context. And the Dirichlet energy is basically Aij in the left-hand metric over here, the energy metric. It's the ground truth adjacency between nodes I and j. And HIL and HJL is the Euclidean distance between the representations at layer L of nodes I and j, so concepts I and j. And if the model actually is representing the structure of the graph and its representations, then this metric will keep on going down as the model keeps on learning the graph structure. So this is what the results look like. As you're doing this walk, you can see the PC on the right-hand side. And when the accuracy starts to increase, when the energy minimizes, you'll see that actually the graph structure gets reflected in the representations themselves. So, when we first did this experiment, this was like directly motivated by another paper where we were actually studying the pre-training dynamics of learning a formal language, where the state space was actually just like defined by us. But when I was working on that project, we were like, technically, you can just do this in context because we're not making any assumptions about the learner. So that's kind of how this project emerges, where like in context, you can actually show structured representations emerge in a model. And it's really, really cool because I personally would not have expected such clean representations to emerge. And like the idea that you can like override or at least augment semantics that the model understands about concepts. So something like apple is maybe a fruit, maybe a company, according to the model at the end of pre-training. But here, what we're saying is apple's representation is most similar to the representation of a bird and house. So like you've actually overridden or like augmented the semantics that the model had about the notion of an app. And funny enough, this task is not necessarily the first demonstration of the sorts, but it's the first demonstration in language models. Specifically, a similar phenomenon can be observed in humans, where on the left-hand side over here in panel A, you have a graph structure where concepts we're sure humans have seen before are imposed as nodes of the graph. You take a random walk on this structure, and you flash images to a human being, a human subject, as they're sitting and observing these. And as they're sitting and observing these images, in accordance with the random walk, you keep on taking fMRI recordings of their brain, and you'll find that if you simply do an MDS visualization of these recordings, you can in fact pull out the graph structure from the brain data itself. So you can see it's very similar to what we were doing. Rather than showing images, you can just show tokens or words, and it's essentially the same task at that point, that you can show tokens to a language model and see if its brain, as in its representations, show the graph structure. Okay, happy to take any quick questions if anybody has any burning questions right now. Otherwise, I'm happy to move on to. I can pause for 5 seconds. And cool. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so in the second paper, algorithmic phases of inconvex learning, what we're going to do now is that we have a toy task which is able to capture the phenomenon we were trying to explain, the many-shot jailbreaking phenomenon. Now, the next step we want to take is that the task was still being performed with a language model in context. It's a pre-trained language model. We don't quite know what went into the model. It's also like a messy model, so it's hard to necessarily reverse engineer or tinker around with it. But if you think about it, the task is very simple. It's just random walk. It's a Markovian random walk on a graph structure. So you can take this to heart and just define a new take this to heart and just define from scratch that if I had pre-trained a model from scratch, a simple toy transformer to perform this task, would it show similar phenomenology?
Sorry,
So that's this
Ekdeep,
big.
looks like there's a
Yep.
question in the chat.
Yep. So my cursor is not really visible to me. Would you mind
I'll
just?
read it out loud. What is the
Yeah.
specific finite formal language? So what is the specific formal language being learned? Is it a finite language?
Yeah. So I'd say like this is basically a probabilistic finite automaton, right? This is essentially an HMM that you're trying to learn. And so like it's not some fancy PCFG or anything. It's like a simple regular language. But nevertheless, it has precise syntax associated with it. Apple and bird are neighbors to each other. That's like a rule of the language. You cannot break that rule of the language. But it's probabilistic because you can, rather than going from apple to bird, you can go to apple to house. So there's multiple rules associated per context. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so second paper, algorithmic phases of incarnate learning. Co-conspirators again. So in this paper, what we were doing now is that we take inspiration from the task as we were talking about before, the in the previous paper we have a Markovian random walk being performed on a structured state space or a structured graph. Now, taking this to heart, what I'm going to do is I'm going to define n Markovian generative processes. So specifically, I'm going to take n transition matrices, and from there, I'm going to sample sequences in an online fashion. So like I'm going to train a transformer from scratch. Every iteration of training, I'm going to first sample one transition matrix from my capital N transition matrices. From it, I sample a sequence and simply do next token prediction to learn said sequences. So I'm just trying to learn a mixture of Markov chains. What I can do is at evaluation time, I can perform two kinds of evaluations, an in distribution evaluation or an outer distribution evaluation. The in distribution evaluation is you take a novel transition matrix, a transition matrix that the model has seen before during training. You sample sequences from that. And let's say one of the sequences ends at 2. Then you look at the next token probabilities and you say that that's the model's predicted next token probabilities. So that's the state to state transitions from 2 to other state transition that the model predicts. But because T star was defined by you, you actually know what the ground truth state to state transitions are. So you can just compare via KL what the model's predicted transition probabilities are versus what the ground truth transition probabilities are. And that then offers you a metric of like, is the model able to simulate or in context infer the transition probabilities for the sequences offered in context. And to be clear, like you can do this in distribution, as I was saying before. The T star can be defined in distribution from one of the capital N transition matrices seen during training. But you can also define an outer distribution evaluation. So you can just sample a new T star that the model has never seen before during training and check whether it is able to it is able to infer T star from the sequences offered in context and continue them further in accordance with the rules defined by T star. So just to give away like the main result, we see this rich phenomenology emerge in this very, very simple setting. So here in this 3D phase diagram shown in the middle, we find that actually the model as a function of context, the axis we were exploring before, scaling up the context. On the x-axis, we have the amount of training that the model goes through. And on the y-axis, we have a notion of data diversity. How many transition matrices does the model get to see during training? And you see that as a function of these three core parameters, the model learns a completely different solution for performing the task. So essentially, these are solutions that I'll talk about in a second, but like I can write these solutions down in a Python program, and the next token predictions made by my program will be equal to the next token predictions made by my model. So like we have a perfect description, at least programmatically or behaviorally, of the model in these four phases. And the transitions between these phases as a function of these three parameters are often quite sharp. When they're continuous, we will offer an explanation for that. Another fun thing here is that for the 6 plots that you see on the sides, pretty much all known phenomenology of in-context learning gets captured in this very simple setting. So like it's nice in that regard that like often for studying in-context learning, people define synthetic tasks and they study like a very specific phenomenon. But in this single setting, you're actually able to reproduce pretty much everything that people had shown before. And that's cool because then, given the simplicity of the setting, we might be able to theoretically analyze what's going on. Okay, so building on that plot now, let's look at precisely what these solutions were. So if you think about it, a Markov chain, there's kind of like 2 core statistics that define that help you distinguish a Markov chain from another chain. So that's kind of like how we're going to come up with these solutions. We're first going to propose them and then see if they actually work versus not, as in like whether they actually explain the model behavior or not. So we're going to think about decomposing solutions along these 2 axes, the statistics, and whether the model relies on the training data at all. So specifically, what I'm going to do is, if I take a transition matrix, I'm going to sample a sequence from that. And as I was saying before, there's only 2 core statistics that can help you distinguish between 2 Markov chains: the unigram distribution, or essentially the stationary distribution of a chain, versus its bigram distribution of transitions, or the transition matrix. what you can do is once you take the sequence, you can infer the in-context frequencies with which different states are observed versus the in-context frequency with which different state-to-state transitions are observed. And then you can compare the histograms with respect to the stationary distributions of the transition matrices you saw during training versus the transition matrices themselves. And based upon this, we'll get four solutions. The first two solutions, UniRet, corresponds to unigrams-based retrieval. So what you're doing is essentially a Bayesian average, where you compute the distance between the in-context histogram versus the ground truth stationary distribution of the different transition matrices. And then you check based on the average distance with respect to the different transition matrices. You simply perform a weighted average of the different transition matrices, and then make a next token prediction in accordance with the transition matrix, which was the closest, which was the Bayesian average, according to the weights defined by this distance function. Meanwhile, you can do unigram-based inference, which is you take the unigram statistics, but you have no reliance on the training data. So you simply make a next token prediction in accordance with the frequency statistics of the sequence seen in context. You can do the same thing now with bigram statistics. So bigram-based inference, which would be use the bigram statistics to make a next token prediction in accordance with the in-context bigram statistics. Or you can do bigram-based retrieval, where you take the bigram statistics, compute their distance with respect to the transition matrices of seen during training, and just do a weighted average based upon that. And as we can expect, these different solutions can be expected to generalize in this way, where different pluses are the number of plus signs are how well we expect it to generalize. So bigram-based inference, because it doesn't have a reliance on the training data, we can expect it to generalize equally on both inference solutions, unigram and bigram. But because sufficient statistics of Markov chains are bigram statistics, we can expect bigram-based inference to generalize substantially better. Meanwhile, bigram-based retrieval is kind of the base optimal thing you can do if you have a finite set of processes that you're trying to learn. So in distribution, we can expect it to have the best generalization abilities, but outer distribution, it should completely fail because it can only generalize to an interpolation of the end transition matrices. So let's see, again, these were speculated solutions. So let's see if they actually pan out. What we're going to do to check that is, first, we're going to compute what we call a bigram utilization test. I'm going to take a context, a sequence, offer it to the model in context, and compute its next token predictions. And if the model does not rely on any higher order statistics, then what I can do is I can just shuffle the sequence and compute the next token predictions again. And if the predictions don't change, then the model solely relies on the unigram statistics because they're order invariant. So what you can see in the left plot in panel A over here is that as a function of training and as a function of data diversity, there's this really sharp transition that occurs such that right before that, the model solely relies on unigram statistics, but after that, it at least relies on higher order non-unigram statistics. As we will see in a second, these are actually bigram statistics. This sharp transition occurs because for computing any higher order statistics, specifically bigram statistics, you need an induction head. So that specific point is where an induction head forms. That's why the model just could not compute bigram statistics before. Second is what we're talking about, the kind of dependence the model has on its training data. So we're going to perform this test called proximity to retrieval. In particular, what I'm going to do is I'll take the sequences that were shown to the model in context, and I'm going to intentionally use sequences which were outer distribution. So the model has not seen these sequences before, or the transition matrices used to sample these sequences before. Then I'm going to compute the model's predicted transition probabilities and compute their similarity with respect to the seen transition matrices versus a set of unseen transition matrices. If the model has a dependence on the seen transition matrices, then the distance with respect to those transition matrices, an average of that, should be lower compared to a distance with respect to an unseen set of transition matrices. This metric is slightly convoluted, so I generally do not present it in the slide, but I'm happy to talk about it later. But the way we define it, if you have a score of 1, you are performing solely a retrieval-based approach. And if you have a score of 0, then you're performing an inference-based approach. So you don't have a reliance on training data. And what we can see over here is that as a function of training, and if the data diversity is low, the model solely relies on the training data. So it is performing a retrieval-based approach. But if the diversity is increased, it's kind of has a sense or a flavor of like the model's capacity is being hit, its capacity limit is being hit, so it cannot memorize all the training transition matrices it has to memorize in order to perform next token predictions. So what it's going to do is it's going to just like learn to generalize outer distribution. It's going to rely on using the in context statistics for making next token predictions. I'm going to say that this is like a decent intuitive model to use right now. But you can see if you look at the frontier of this boundary between the inference and retrieval approach, like that boundary is kind of like a sublinear rate, growing at a sublinear rate. So it's highly plausible that it just keeps going and we haven't trained enough. And I will show later that like that's actually in fact the case, that we trained this for 2 days, but if you keep training further, it's just going to keep on going. So it's not a capacity limit based argument which explains this plot. Okay, so if we take these two panels, the statistics the model uses versus whether it relies on retrieval or inference, you can simply take a Cartesian product of that and you'll get these four phases. So for example, the green phase corresponds to, we argue the model is probably using a unigrams-based inference approach. The blue phase is like bigrams-based inference approach. And to check whether this is actually the case, because these are self-speculated, what you can do is you can compute the KL between, because these solutions are something you can actually write down programmatically in Python. You can just write down these solutions and check whether the predictions made by these solutions versus the actual model, they are in line with each other. So you can compute the KL between them, and you'll find that our predicted regions where the model should perform in accordance to our analysis, the model's behavior should be explained by these algorithms. You find that, in fact, those are the regions where the KL is approximately 0. So those are the regions where the model behavior is best explained by these algorithms we were talking about. So this also says that indeed the model was using bigram statistics, not higher order statistics. Okay, on that note, people often say in context learning works in XYZ way, depending on whatever phenomenon they're trying to explain. I think like this is just like not a meaningful statement to be talking about anymore. What we're showing in this result, in this very simple setting, and we know similar phenomenology occurs at scale as well, that as a function of different parameters, as a function of your setting, the model can be in different phases. It can be using different solutions for performing in context learning, different behaviors for performing in context learning. So there isn't really a unified explanation for it. It's kind of like an umbrella term. To learn in context is an umbrella term. In context learning itself is an umbrella term. And there's different behaviors that you can associate with in context learning. There's different ways of performing in context learning, each of which will offer you a different explanation. So claims are confounded by which phase you're in. Okay, so what we went through in this paper is we took a simple setting that was inspired by the in context learning of representations project. And then we showed that in this very simple setting, as a function of these three parameters, context, training, and data diversity, the model learns four kinds of solutions, what solutions the model learns. We explained when it learns it. We're able to characterize precisely when the model performs in accordance with these solutions. And we, in the paper, also have a characterization of how these solutions get implemented. So specifically, as I was saying before, when induction head emerges, that's when the model can start to perform bigram-based solutions. When the model is in retrieval-based phases, so like unigram retrieval or bigram retrieval, we can actually literally reconstruct transition matrices that the model has memorized from its MLP weights. So the model is truly memorizing the solutions to perform a retrieval-like approach. We cannot do this in inference-based when the model is in inference regimes. And we're not the first one to perform analyses of the sorts. There's similar flavor of results here and there. For example, there was this really popular setting of in-context linear regression that people used to study, where you just offer in-context exemplars of like high-dimensional vector maps to a label by some regression class, so some regression weights. And you keep on showing the model these exemplars and then see what its next token probabilities will be, next token predictions will be for a novel query. What you'll find is the model eventually starts to learn how to perform in-context linear regression. But as a function of data diversity, as shown in this second plot over here, the Raventis et al. Plot, The model starts off by performing more like what they call DMMSE. It's kind of like discrete minimum mean square estimator, which is like our retrieval solutions. It basically does a Bayesian average over the hypotheses it has seen before. Versus once you keep on increasing the number of tasks, as the diversity increases, the model starts to perform like ridge regression, which is the Bayes optimal on the overall distribution. And similarly to our training time results, there was this recent paper at ICML, which showed that the phenomenon that we were observing, that as a function of training time, the model eventually starts to work like a retrieval-based approach, starts off with an inference approach, but then can start to perform like a retrieval approach, also holds for in-context linear regression. And similar results have also been shown in in-context classification setting. So what we have achieved up to this point is kind of the ability to like unify a lot of the existing phenomenology into a single setting and show that this drives a lot of the in-context transitions that we might observe, and the transitions are not only happening in context, they happen also as a function of other parameters of the training pipeline. Now, the question is why? Why does varying experimental strategies, experimental conditions lead to these different strategies being used? So to that end, we'll get into this last paper. In-context learning strategies emerge rationally. Again, my conspirators. Okay, so if we think about it at a high level, what we were doing in the previous project is we're saying that there's a mixture of tasks. There's a distribution defined by a mixture of tasks that the model has to learn. So the tasks here are some sort of functional that you can expect. So like in context linear regression, you're learning how to perform some specific linear regression map. So the weights of this map are sampled from some distribution that will say is some tau true. So some true distribution is where the weights of this map come from. And the training distribution is essentially like a discrete hypothesis space where there's, let's say, D tasks that I have to learn. And that kind of defines my training distribution. Now, when we train a model to learn this mixture of tasks and perform next token predictions over samples from these tasks. And this very simple framework already starts to unify a lot of the known settings. So with linear regression, as I was talking about just a second ago, you have a mixture of tasks, and each task corresponds to weights coming from some prior distribution, the tau true, which in most papers is just some normal distribution. And you learn to perform in-context linear regression based on that. Similar results, similar formulation can be done for classification. And we'll introduce a new setting called balls and urns, which is a simplification of our Markov chain setting. Essentially, in Markov chains, you needed a bigram bigram statistic with the sufficient statistics. Here, what we're going to do is this is kind of like the standard classical probability theory problem that I have an urn. It has balls of different types. I'm going to show you a one-by-one sample balls and show them to you with replacement. And then I'm going to ask you, what is the probability a ball of a certain type will be seen at the next turn? So all that you have to do is you have to keep count of frequencies with which different balls are observed, and that's kind of like the unique the optimal solution that you can learn over here, the Bayes optimal solution. So it's similar to what we were doing in the Markov chains, but rather than bigram statistics, what you have to do is you have to compute unigram statistics now. So we remove the statistics axis, but the reliance on training data axis still remains for defining solutions. So the question now is, we have this simple framework. Can we just, at a high level, define what would be optimal behaviors if the model were trained on this kind of a mixture of task setting? So if you think about it, we have a mapping, a function from which we sample a sequence and offer it to the model in context. If the model was to perform optimally with respect to the training distribution, we essentially are talking about a Bayesian averaging solution where the prior that the model assumes is discrete over the D hypotheses, the D functions that the model got to see during training. You can think of this as like a memorizing solution where you've memorized the training distribution. The bar for memorization keeps increasing every day in our community. So like now what we would have called generalization 5 years ago, we call it memorizing, but such is life. Meanwhile, we have let's say if the model were to be performing perfectly with respect to the true distribution from which the weights or the parameters for these functions were sampled, then we can expect like the base optimal behavior for that is to assume a continuous prior over the entire distribution tau 2 and compute the posterior predictive with respect to that. And that would be what we'll call a generalizing solution. This generalizing solution has no dependence on specifically the set of functions that were seen during training. So the model can, in fact, generalize to completely novel function mappings. So if I have f of w x or f of w k, any new weights or any new set of parameters, the model should be able to generalize to that in the latter solution. And what we find is that if we take the prior existing settings and this Ball and Nernst settings that we were talking about, and even the Markov chain setting that we talked about before, the solutions we were presenting in these papers that were presented in these papers or that we just presented in our paper can be formalized under this framing. So the DMMSE solution, for example, in linear regression is in fact precisely the base optimal solution with respect to tau train. Meanwhile, ridge regression is the base optimal with respect to tau true. In the balls and urn setting, if you were to take the in-context sequence, compute the count, the unigram distribution, and do a Bayesian average with respect to specifically the discrete set of hypotheses, the set of urns that you get to see during training, that would be a memorizing solution. But versus if you simply learn to in-context infer the unigram statistics and make an extra prediction in accordance with that, that would be the base optimal solution for the entire true distribution. So assuming a continuous prior over the true distribution. And similarly for classification. So what this does is like it really offers us a unifying language to talk about pretty much all the results we were talking about before. And then, as I was saying, like if it is a unifying language, it should unify the phenomenology we observe. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my model, I'm going to, for different settings, offer it in context sequences and compute its next token probabilities. So H here corresponds to a model that I've trained. G is the generalizing solution, M is the memorizing solution. And I'm going to compute the distances of the model's next token predictions with respect to the generalizing and memorizing solution and just see whether the model's predictions are closer to generalizing solution or to memorizing solution. So this is kind of like a behavioral measure for assessing whether the model is more like generalizing solution or memorizing solution. And what you see is similar to the phase diagrams I was showing you before in the Markov chain setting, you can get similar results over here. As a function of training on the x-axis and as a function of data diversity on the y-axis, I'm plotting the relative distance here on the measure R. And if R is equal to 0, the model is perfectly performing like a generalizing solution. If R equals 1, the model is perfectly performing like a memorizing solution. We have to rescale R, so it's technically 2R plus 1, but 2R minus 1. But that's just to get the results to scale between 0 to 1. But what you see over here is as a function of training time, the model for any given data diversity, if the diversity is low, then it starts off performing in a memorizing fashion. It just memorizes the hypotheses. But if the diversity is slightly high, let's say 2 to the power 6, then the model starts off performing closer to a generalizing solution. But there's a transition that occurs as a function of training, and then it starts to perform like a memorizing solution. So it performs in accordance with a memorized set of hypotheses. So this is in spirit of what we were talking about before, that it's like inference to retrieval is where the model goes. Or if you increase the data diversity, the model starts off with a retrieval approach, but then arrives at an inference approach. And you can get the same results or similar results for other settings as well. So linear regression and classification. Classification looks slightly janky, and it's just a bad setting, very honestly. It's one of the weirdest settings I've ever done any experiments with. So I don't really have a great explanation, except for it's just a weird setting. Yep. Okay, so the first thing we wanted to do in order to explain why we were observing our phenomenology is first like take the framework and then show that there is some reasonable behavior here, that the model is just transitioning between optimal solutions for the training distribution and the true distribution from which the data is being sampled. And this is very evocative of like in psychology or cognitive science, what people call rational analysis, that if you want to explain a learner's behavior, think about the learner trying to optimally adapt to the data that it is being offered to its environment, but assume that it has some computational constraints. It cannot perform unbounded computations. So it cannot act optimally with respect to the data just like whatever is the optimal behavior with respect to data, but it can perform optimally given its computational constraints. So let's try to unpack this in a sec for a second for our specific setup. What is optimal behavior for us? We saw that there are two optimal behaviors for the distributions we're working with, the training distribution and the true distribution. So the memorizing predictor or the generalizing predictor that the model can learn. But then if the model has to optimally act, it has to optimally behave for any given sequence. One thing we can assume is that the model is just interpolating between these two solutions in accordance with the posterior probability that it accords with these two hypotheses, the memorizing predictor or the generalizing predictor. So basically, Bayesian inference tells us what the optimal way of performing in a discrete hypothesis space of memorizing and generalizing predictor would be, which is just computer posterior predictive. So here, what I'm doing is S tau train is my training data. I'm training a model on this training data, and then I'm computing what its posterior probability is for what the posterior probability for the memorizing predictor is if a model were to be trained on this distribution versus the posterior probability for the generalizing predictor. And then I'm going to interpolate these two predictors in accordance with that. Now, of course, where do these probabilities come from? That would be the question. So for that, we're going to go back to our computational constraints argument. We know neural networks show two very well-known computational constraints. One, that the rate at which loss goes down, as in the evidence accumulates, follows a power law scaling. And neural networks generally have a preference to learn simpler solutions. So the way we are going to operationalize this is we want to compute the posterior probability of a predictor F given some training data S. We can break this down into the evidence for that F offers for the training data, so probably the likelihood of S given F, or the prior of that the learner associates with the function F. For the likelihood, if you assume scaling laws hold, you can derive this result, which shows that the likelihood scales as a function of n, the training steps, as a power law, times the likelihood of the data given the function f. So the precise likelihood, because these will be like preemptively definable Python programs that we can write down for these predictors, we can actually compute this likelihood function. Meanwhile, a simplicity bias. So what we're going to say is that the models have a prior, which is kind of like has a structure of a universal prior from algorithmic information theory, that the prior associated with function f is 2 to the power some complexity k of f or some free parameter beta. So k of f ideally would be the Kolmogorov complexity, but we are not talking about Turing machines. We're talking about a neural network. So we're going to assume there's like some implementation cost, and that's what beta is supposed to model. But we still need k of f, and we don't have k of f. So we're going to do the standard thing people do. We're going to literally write down our solutions in Python programs and compress them. So we're going to use bit rates to see if they help us explain an actual neural network's behavior. So you take those two assumptions, you put them into the log and you use them to compute essentially this eta term, eta of n comma d. N is the number of training steps, d is the data diversity or the number of hypotheses seen in the discrete hypothesis space, and use that to compute log posterior odds, where posterior corresponding to the predictor m versus g. We have the prior, the computational constraints assumptions that we made about that. And we also have an assumption about how evidence accumulates, so how the likelihood scales. When you take those assumptions and fit that in, you'll get an expression that looks like this. So the first term corresponds to the difference in the loss that the two predictors, M and G, will have on the training data. And the difference in loss depends on D because the memorizing predictor is an interpolation between discrete set of hypotheses, so D hypotheses. Meanwhile, delta K is the difference in the predictor's complexity. So how different, like how much more complex predictor M is with respect to predictor G. And what you can do is once you have this posterior predictive, these posterior probabilities, you can take these posterior probabilities, just run them through a sigmoid and put them back into the posterior predictive expression we were talking about. And that gives you now a predictor. Like you can use this. There is no model involved. There's no neural network involved here. There are simply parameters that we have, the alpha, beta, gamma parameter, and the predictors that we wrote down in Python. So this is a simple, straightforward equation. what we find is this equation actually captures the phenomenology we were observing before. So you can not only can you use this equation to capture the relative distance maps. In fact, the equation makes next token predictions that the model was making. So offering it any novel example, which is in distribution or distribution, the models, the actual neural networks training next token predictions match the next token predictions from this predictor itself, this formally written down predictor. And it holds for basically all settings. So the R square with next token predictions, total variation distance with next token predictions, depending on the metric, depends on which setting we're talking about, perfectly captured by this equation above there. So, and you can just keep on making bigger and bigger, more and more complex settings, and you'll find that the phenomenology keeps on holding. The simple equation, in fact, captures pretty much everything in different settings of different size of state space, context length, model size, blah, blah, blah. So I'll maybe come back to this plot later. Okay. So what are we saying over here, right? We're saying that this expression of essentially like a free energy expression of like the log posterior odds is related to the difference in the loss that each solution has and the difference in their complexity. So in some sense, what we're saying is the prior odds, which is the difference in complexity, as you increase data diversity, you're penalizing the prior that the model has over a memorizing solution. So even though the memorizing solution is the base optimal solution to learn, if I offer you a discrete set of hypotheses, because there are so many hypotheses that I have to memorize the weights for, the parameters for, I'd rather just not do that and just learn an approximation of some sort of a true generalizing solution, as in the true prior distribution itself, the true distribution itself. So you increase the prior over the generalizing predictor by increasing diversity. Meanwhile, as a function of training, what I'm showing you is evidence for the memorizing solution, because as we talked about before, memorizing solution will in fact have a better loss. So eventually gradient descent is supposed to take us to solutions with better loss, and that's what we are trying to achieve by increasing the training steps. When you have a critical point where, let's say I had a prior, but like the likelihood starts to become the dominating term, I prefer, let's say, the generalizing solution, but the likelihood prefers, oh wow, that was funny. But the likelihood prefers solutions that express their data better. There will be a transition that occurs, and the model will now start to perform like a memorizing predictor rather than a generalizing predictor. So that's basically what is captured by the posterior odds. And so these intuitive picture that we were offering before, if you take our actual expressions and compute the log prior odds or the log base factor, as in the how much prior the model has over a generalizing solution versus memorizing solution, and which solution explains the data better, and you simply take a sum of that, you get the plot on the right hand side, which is in fact the structurally similar to the plot we were speculating or we were arguing you will observe if this explanation holds. So this is essentially the summary of the main results, that as a function of training, you are arriving at the likelihood becomes a dominating term, and hence you are arriving at a solution which explains the data better. As a function of data diversity or the task diversity, the number of hypotheses you have to learn, you are favoring solutions which are simpler to express. And in accordance with that, you'll prefer to learn generalizing solutions. And when transitions occur in the model behavior, they are being led by a switch between which solution the model learns as a function of what explains their data better versus what is simpler to implement. So this is essentially reminiscent of Occam's razor. And this is my co-author made using GPT an image of William of Ockham holding a razor. Cool. Thank you.